Okay, thanks for showing up. I'm gonna wait just a little bit and see if a few more people plug in before getting started. Yeah, thanks for being here. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. But today we're going over color theory. I'm gonna wait, I don't know, 5 minutes, and then we'll get started. In the meantime, I'm just going to sorry, I think I got disconnected there for a second. Yeah, anyways, I'm going to sketch for a bit, and then we'll get started. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat so I know who's here, and yeah, we'll get started soon. Hey, Jeff. How's it going? Hey, Genevieve. Happy Monday yourself. I am just making some notes here so I can talk about this stuff in a semi-coherent way. Okay, we might as well get started, I guess. So what I'm going to be showing everybody that plugs into this today is how I deal with color. This has always been a little bit of a tough thing for me. I think where I am weakest and my design sensibilities is actually color understanding. Part of that is because I'm red-green colorblind, but honestly, I think a bigger part of it is it's just not something that comes naturally to me. I don't know why that is. I appreciate color, like I have really strong feelings towards it, but for whatever reason, like in design, I always have a really hard time picking what color to make something. So I've come up with a couple of workarounds to deal with that. So I'm going to share some of my thought process with you here. So before we start thinking about color, I just want to go over some kind of basic talking points about how to talk about the different aspects of color, and that's these three things right here: hue, saturation, brightness. And if you look on the top right up here of my Photoshop screen, hue, saturation, brightness is how I always have my Photoshop set up. Like you can change it to RGB, which is a little more like technically correct. CMYK, which is very hard to understand. CMYK is for print color. RGB is for digital color. I think that's right. But hue, saturation, brightness allows you to change hue, which is all the colors on the color wheel. Saturation, which is the amount of color. So 0 saturation is black and white, and 100% saturation is full color. So red at full saturation and full brightness is this bright red, but at 0 saturation it becomes white. So I think in this case, essentially white is the absence of color. And then brightness just changes your grayscale, which is pretty self-explanatory. But one way I have found to kind of sidestep my issues with color is to just think about grayscale first. Often when I'm working on a design, I will start with a completely gray object. And I'm just going to shade up this sphere real quick to talk about this concept. So I'm going to give myself a super soft brush. And isolate that part. These pixels, that's what this little square is up here. And just shade this real quick. So this is just really rudimentary shading for a sphere. So at the widest point with a single light source, a sphere is going to have an elliptical warm spot and then kind of this equator of darkness. And if you want to start thinking about the sphere being in a studio environment, there's going to start to be bounce light. So if we imagine this background being a white background, wherever the sphere gets closer to something that's a lighter color, there will be more bouncing happening. So on the very bottom here, even though that's where the floor, or whatever you want to call it, is, and you would imagine that it's darker on the bottom, which it is, it's dark on the bottom, but there's still going to be some bounce light, and then there's going to be a little bit of occlusion. And occlusion is when an object reflects against itself. So occlusion happens right here where the sphere is intersecting with the floor, and I will give myself a quick shadow. And as the shadow gets further away from the object, it's going to get less precise, so it's going to get softer around the edges. And then in the same way that the sphere is darker where it's touching the shadow is also going to be darker where it's touching the sphere. So there would essentially be a little spot right where they meet where you can't really tell which is which. So I'll lighten that up just a little bit. And then the last little bit, I'm just going to add a little bit of material. Like I want the sphere to be semi-glossy, and so you're going to get a little bit of a hard spot, and that's just where the light is coming from. So, okay, so if we think of this sphere right here, what I've done basically is just create a desaturated object here, so there's no color. And so the nice thing about Photoshop, so this is on a layer right here. You can pull up another layer, and because this layer is nested, and all you have to do is hold down Alt on a PC. I don't really know what the equivalent is to a Mac. It's probably Command or Option or one of those things. What you're able to do is then pick a color, and you can paint over the top of it. I'll try to paint something that looks like it's drawn on top. But you can see, like, I'm putting this blue on top of it, but it essentially just fills in that space, and it doesn't really have any relationship to the actual object itself. There's no shadows or anything. This blue is just kind of like there. It makes it look like a weird Easter egg. But what you can do in the filters is very easily come down here to color and click that, and now all of your shading, all of the grayscale, that applies to the color, or more accurately, I should say that this color is applying to everything below it. So it's only imparting the amount of saturation that I've drawn in here on top of the desaturated sphere. So it's a really easy way to work in grayscale and get that all lined up technically. Make a good composition, make things read correctly in black and white, and then you can bring your color in later. And you can see I'm pretty garbage at color choice, just even messing around. And you can see when I grab white, because there's no color, doing white over the top essentially gets rid of the color, because white, as we talked about up here, is the absence of color. So that's essentially what I'm going to be doing here. The nice thing is also that you can bring color in subtly. So if I bring my soft brush back in here and I color pick this blue from the wing, you can do a soft transition. And this is a good way to, if you want to say that the light, if there was a blue light shining on a gray sphere, this is a really good chance to use color to bring in a little, I don't know, touch of interest. So like you could say that there's a blue light shining on this, and then in the background, there's maybe like a bright green light in the room that's casting on this side, and you start to get, you know, some interesting things happening that you can just play around essentially without ruining anything, because you can just do the color layer on top of the gray sphere. Does that make sense so far? So the next thing that I want to show you, and a really great trick using Photoshop. So this is an image that I painted from reference before. And there's a really great trick to use when you're like trying to come up with a good color palette. So what I like to do is find compelling images that have like good color happening. This one I really, really like because I think it's manipulated a little bit, but there's just a lot of really great colors happening here. And one quick thing I'm going to show you is if you press Control U, you can pull up the saturation, but a hotkey is Control Shift U, and it will desaturate an image, and you can see like how dark this image actually is. It's really amazing how your eye can play tricks on you, because like this bright green of the fuselage in the background is actually that dark. And I can prove it by color picking this. So it's this bright green color right here. But if we desaturate this and I put a color layer on top, I can paint that green back in, which is, you know, pretty wild. I think, I don't know, I feel like now that I'm looking at that little experiment and then this, I think there's some extra lightness happening here. So I think color, like taking out the saturation, might actually be darkening it slightly, but I think for our purposes here, we can just use that and, you know, see what it does. So anyways, if I wanted to create a color palette from this, instead of trying to figure out like, you know, what are the main values, like probably that blue, probably that green, this gray, this darker gray, maybe a little bit of yellow. Like instead of doing that, which is a totally valid way to work, a nice little shortcut is going up to your filters and you go to pixelate, and I think the one I like is mosaic. Yeah, so right there. So this is how I made the little image for this video. Like I really like just using the mosaic. Basically, you can change the pixel size, and it just makes it more and more pixelated. So it kind of starts to merge together and turn kind of brown-gray. So you need to find a place where you can still see the most compelling colors. And this one I'm going to keep it pretty tight, actually, because I don't want to lose this bright green and some of these blues. So now, looking at this, like it's much easier to go in and pick, like, you know, do I want this bluer green or do I want this green? And I've got some oranges happening, some grays. But essentially, this is just a really great shortcut to creating a color palette that you can now use for rendering and just be relatively certain that these colors are going to work together, because if they work together in this image, then they will work together in your rendering. So that is what I'm going to put together. Okay, so for the first workshop that I did this little, I don't know, it was a variation on the Hans Wagner chair, which I really like, this wishbone chair that's, you know, very tasteful and pretty well known in design circles. But what I did was I showed how you can take a design language and create something new. So this is essentially a very similar chair, but I've just turned it into a stool. And what I'm going to do is what I just did with that sphere. So first thing I have to do is put in a base layer that is just the light and shadow. So this is going to be a grayscale quick rendering. And knock out all these white spots. And I'm going to move pretty quick through this, so if I do anything in Photoshop that you are curious about how I did a hotkey or something, because I have my Photoshop set up to move pretty quickly, because the way I draw, generally I try to move pretty fast, so I might do something that seems kind of confusing, so feel free to jump in if there is anything that you don't understand. So first step is just laying in a really simple basic lighting scenario. So I've got my gray there, and now I'm just darkening the bottom, lightening the top, just to give it some direction. And that's really easy to do. And I turn down the opacity because you just want that to be like kind of an echo of what's actually happening. And then I'm going to, I usually do shadows first. I don't really have a solid reason why, but I think shadows have more of an effect on a surface than lighting does. I think lighting can be a little ambiguous sometimes, but shadows, I think for whatever reason, they really let your eye understand the form. So I'm going to go in with a really soft brush to start. And because these are all cylinders, it's just going to be a little bit of, I'm also going to turn the opacity down. Because these are all cylinders, there's just going to be a little bit of just shift clicking. So it's just like you click, hold down shift, and then click again, and it makes a straight line in Photoshop, which is really helpful for shapes like this. So just really loosely going in and shading this like it's in a ambiguously lit room. So this is just like, I don't know, I guess you could say it's like studio lighting, where there's no direct light source, but still, because of where we are standing, it's got to have certain rules that apply, like the things that are underneath the seat are going to be darker, for instance. So I'm going to use a slightly bigger brush and just kind of darken that. And it's also going to push it into the background a little bit. And what I'm doing with the lasso tool is just isolating different parts of the design, because now I don't have to worry about overspray. It's essentially like you're using a spray can and you don't want to get paint on certain parts, and so the lasso tool is a super useful little tool that I use in Photoshop all the time. It's especially useful when you're using a soft brush, because a soft brush has a lot of overspray. And so the lasso kind of like keeps it contained. And it's okay if there's a little overspray at this point, because I will go in after I have most of these things kind of blocked out, and I will do just a little bit of a cleaner pass. So this part goes pretty quickly just because of that. Again, just grabbing something, and if you press Control H, that's hide, so you can hide a selection, because I get very distracted by those walking ants, or whatever you want to call them. And then this is a really, the other reason I'm using a soft brush is because most of the surfaces on this chair are very organic and soft, so it wouldn't make a lot of sense to use a hard brush. I mean, I could do it, but it would take a lot of time, because I would have to go over and over to get these subtle gradations to look right, but using this brush, they kind of happen a lot quicker. Oh, Jeff, I meant to ask, what's Stryker doing with all of the hospitals clamoring for medical equipment? Do you guys have like anything on site that you could do to like put stuff together? I heard that Steelcase was able to put together some plexiglass barriers for Spectrum Health in like, I don't know, 3 hours to take in patients that were suspected of being exposed to COVID-19, which I thought was pretty cool. I know they have a really amazing, prototype shop there, so it's a little easier for a company like that, but I was just curious what, if anything, Spectrum's like doing. Or, I'm sorry, Stryker is doing. Okay, so that's the shadow layer. You can see it adds a lot of depth all of a sudden. It's still grayscale, so What I'm going to do now is an overlay layer. An overlay allows light to come through without being overbearing. I don't really know how to explain it better than that. I just know that I use overlay for my light layer because it's subtle. So again, because these are all cylinders, I'm essentially just hitting the widest point of each of these legs, and then a little bit on the edge for the roll-off light. If you look at any round shape, it has a little bit of roll-off that shows right at the edge. So just adding in that highlight is going to set off all of these parts to really, I mean, it's the other side of the shadow. It's like everything looks more intense if you have it contrast with its opposite. So having dark darks next to your lightest lights adds a lot of visual interest and contrast. And then back here, I'm just going to do a little bit because I want these pieces to be rounded. I'm not really going to put any white in there because that would indicate that there was a light source underneath the seat, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but I can get around the outside of it to play up that roundness even more. Same thing with this guy back here. I don't want to add too much light. I essentially want the part that's closest to me, which is this leg, to have the brightest white on it, and then just a little bit on the edge. Okay, so I didn't necessarily mean for this to turn into a rendering tutorial, but that in a nutshell is how you render a simple form with an ambiguous light source. So the way this is shot right now, the light is directly above it. And here's another little trick that I like to use. So I just duplicated that layer. So there's just that gray underneath. And you can see that it's just the shape of the stool. And now I can kind of mess this around and create, I can decide what light direction I want it to go. So if the shadow's pointing in that direction, I'm going to have to relight this slightly to match. But you basically just push and pull the shadow and transform it. I don't know if I like that very much. That usually works better, but this has very clear legs, so it makes it a little bit harder to do believably. You can see that it looks like it's painted on the floor as opposed to an actual shadow, but we can fix that with a little bit of work. I'm just filling this in a little bit so it looks a little more realistic. Yeah, it's a little bit better. I'm just in my head trying to think about what the light source would do to the shadow from this point of view. And then, just like the sphere, I'm going to just lighten up the shadow a little bit in the distance with a soft brush. And then where it's close to the chair, just darken it slightly. And I'm going to darken it a little bit right there in the center. Yeah, so we've got a little bit of a shadow right there. And then the last thing I'm going to do is do the ambient occlusion. So that's what I was talking about before, where it's where two parts come together. And it doesn't go black, but it does get pretty dark. And these won't mean a lot initially, but I really feel like these little spaces where the object casts its own shadow become really important to the viewer when you're just like looking at this from a distance, because these things start to make it feel realistic. And so essentially all I'm doing is just darkening the spots where two surfaces kind of come together. Nothing special, it's just a little trick to add a little bit of realism. Especially these cast shadows where you can show that there's a light source, and right underneath these parts that have little overhangs is where you're going to see that stuff. So let's see if you can see the difference. So that's without it, and that's with it. I don't know, it just adds a little bit of visual interest that I don't think would be there normally. And the last thing I'm going to do is, you know, looking back on the reference, that's not it. Looking back on the reference I talked about here, remember how dark this gets? So there's almost no white in that image. So I need to be cognizant of that, and I'm going to add in just essentially a black box. And what this black box is going to allow me to do is add darkness to the chair. So what I'm going to do now is colorize this, and if I need to darken any of those colors, I can just turn this on and off. So it's just doing layers and layers of simple color and tone shifts that will allow me to really dial this in really quickly. So again, what I'm going to do to figure out what colors I want to make these chairs is reference. So I've decided to pull from, you know, like an interior design inspiration, because, you know, you think furniture and then, you know, my head goes to interiors. So I've got these 3 interior design images that are all slightly different in terms of their color composition, but I'm going to use each of these to create a different color palette. So let's see, I'm just going to hit all 3 of these with that same filter that I used before. So it just simplifies each of these things into its base components in terms of color. Hit that one, and then let's do this one. So all of a sudden you've got these like interesting color palettes to work off of. If you zoom out, they still kind of look like the original image, just blurry. But once you zoom in, it's just, you know, it's a field of color to pick from. So because this chair is, you know, it's made out of presumably wood and a seat color, I think I'm going to pick a max of, let's say three colors for each one. So I've got these little boxes that I set up earlier, just so I can see what I'm doing, because I don't want to be coming back to this reference necessarily. So I'm just going to pick some colors that I like in this space. So I really like this kind of olivey green. Within this box, I'm also going to define a primary, secondary, tertiary, because another thing about color, just like anything else, is you want to have balance. And generally that means having a primary color choice. It's like picking a red car with, like, you know, gold or chrome wheels. You don't want a red car with red wheels. You want something to like contrast and set off the primary. So I'm trying to pick things that do that in a nice way. So I've got that kind of earthy color there, and then there's a lot of white here, so I should probably grab something that fills that in. So it's not white, but there we go. So I've got kind of my primary, secondary, tertiary. And from here, this one's got a lot of really interesting things happen. I definitely want one of these bright reds. Genevieve, the filter is called, you go up here to the top, you'll filter, and then pixelate, and it's called mosaic. Filter, pixelate, mosaic, and then you can change the size of, like right now you can only see those little colors up there because that affects the layer that I'm on. I'm on this color layer, but that's how you get to it. Filter, pixelate, mosaic. You just have to make sure the layer that you want to do is selected. Okay, so back here, I really like that red, but it's definitely not a primary. It's more of a secondary. And then I really like these greens happening in here. And then I think based on the rest of this image, I want kind of a cool gray that would fit. Maybe something like this. I think that'll be my primary. Maybe I want something darker actually. Yeah, I think that looks better. There we go. And the third one. This one's really nice. This one has some really nice browns, some greens, and I really like that deep blue. Let's see, it's not the primary color in this photo, but that's not why I chose the photo. I need to make choices that are going to work for the chair, so I'm thinking about what I want the chair to look like and then making the decisions based on that. So I actually like this really deep, dark brown. I pulled off the floor. This blue is really interesting, and I think it will offset this brown really well. Yeah, I think that's nice. I want a slightly, that's darker. I want a slightly lighter brown. Yeah, I guess we'll stick with that. And then there's this, I don't know, I think this used to be like a brass, but I think this would be a nice tertiary. So essentially what I've done is what would have taken me, I don't know, maybe half an hour, possibly longer to figure out, but now I've got 3 different color scenarios that I'm going to apply to each of these chairs. I'm just going to put these down a little bit. So again, the nice thing about doing all of this in Photoshop is that you can just group all these layers and shift it over. Come on. I think I had something selected and it wasn't letting me move it. Okay, there's that one and this one, and I'm just going to drop these in real quick. Okay, so now what I can do for each of these, so this is the one on the left, so just go left to right. Okay, so all of these layers right here are essentially my rendering. So this one's my black, so what I want to do is add my color layer. I'll name it so I don't get lost. Sorry, I'm going to stand up. It got dark in here again on me, and I never remembered to turn the lights on. This one. Okay, now I can see my keyboard. Okay, so this is my color layer, and that is going to be applied on top of all of the other rendering layers. It's going to be nested just like everything else on top of this gray. So this is my primary, and I can just fill it. So that was just Alt backspace will fill. You can see it just like filled it in, and there's no shadows. Everything's gone. But all we have to do is go up here to color, and it puts in the color over the top. Now you can see. I guess I want the color on top actually. You can see it's quite a bit lighter than what I had in mind, so all I have to do now is take my black layer and start to increase the opacity until that brown kind of looks like what I had up there, and I'd say that's just about it right there. So that's just with a gray background, that's just brown over a desaturated gray, and then you add a little bit of a darker value, and it allows more of the color to show through. Because like looking at the saturation and brightness up here, the saturation and brightness work together. you can change the color feel by playing with the brightness. Like you bring it all the way down here and it's black, you bring it up here and it's yellow. There's a lot of space in between to play around. So we've got our primary color, and then secondary. I think I'm just going to do the seat in this kind of lighter taupey brown. And it's probably not taupe. Taupe to me is like a kind of a khaki color, but then again, I don't know offhand because I am bad at color, which is why I steal them from images. But you really shouldn't think about it as stealing because it's no different, at least in my mind, to, you know, looking out the window and choosing those colors. You just have to be looking at your computer screen. Oh, I see why this is being so weird because I was painting on that black layer. Photoshop is a very good idea to make sure that your layer is correct before you start painting things in. And I could paint it, or I could just use our friend the lasso tool again, select everything that I want to fill, and with a simple click, I can fill that in. So here, you can see that that seat looks quite a bit darker than this color. So again, that means that I just have to go to this layer, which is my, you know, darkness, lightness layer, and having that still selected so you can see what I'm doing here, I am going to change the lightness of this space. So hue saturation. Now I can take this black and change it. So this is what's happening underneath the color. I mean, you can't darken it because black is already as black as it's going to go, but you can start to bring it up. And this is just making gray right now, but if I turn the color back on and I bring that saturation up now, as I lighten that black background, it starts to look just like my color. There you go. And the reason that works is because, so my color right here, I'm going to bring this layer up just to show you real quick. So these three colors across the top also have brightness values. These are not all this equal brightness, and you can see that when I take away the saturation. So especially this one in the middle, like see how bright this yellow is? It looks crazy bright here when it's colorized. But if you take the saturation away, these two colors are a lot closer than I would have thought that they were. And I don't know if that's because of the way my eyes work or if that's actually how the color works, but these changes that you see when you lose the color is what I'm adjusting when I adjust this this black and, well, now gray color adjustment. So you can see it was just gray, and this is with my dark layer and my slightly lighter layer on top of that. So now I'm going to add in the last little bit, which is the tertiary color, which is this white, which I know for a fact has very little black in it. And so this one, I'm actually going to just pick as is and paint on top. So I think in this case, maybe doing just the ends of all these legs in a light kind of highlight color would be a nice way to do that. So this is a pretty subtle design. Maybe you could go in and do the tips of the legs. No, that would look weird white. Maybe this whole piece up here, potentially. I don't know. I don't think I like that either. So, you know what I could do is, let's say this is an upholstered chair. Maybe it would look nice. And this might look a little gaudy too. I'm not thinking too much about the design. I'm just trying to show how I would pick colors. So let's say like maybe this has stitching or something around the top. Beautiful stitch lines. Okay, so there you go. There are three colors working together. I think maybe it looks better without the white. Yeah, I think it probably does. So you don't always have to force it. I just picked three, so I would have enough to choose from, knowing that three was probably my my max that I would use. But so there's the first one. So this guy is going to get a little more paint treatment. I think looking at the one on the left, it kind of looks like it could be painted wood or maybe just a subtle stain, but this one maybe we can be a little zanier with, like, if this is like a custom setup or something. Um, I know that I have this gray as my primary, but I think I'm going to call an audible and do something with this red because I think that's really fun. So again, making another layer that sits on top of everything else. Call it my color layer. Change its layer mode to color, so it just applies color and nothing else to all the layers below it. Let's start with this red and see what it looks like. So again, it looks way off picking that color and putting it over the gray, and that is because it does not have enough black in it. So all I have to do is bring that black layer up until it looks like a deep dark red like this one does. I think I might have gone just a little bit too far. It's at 72%, so I'll bring it down to maybe, I don't know, like 65. So those look pretty similar to me. Another way you can just test this if you really wanted to is color pick and then just connect your parts with a line. So you can see that if you get really close, I'm a little bit off here. So I don't know what, no, I didn't have enough black. And you can see like on the light side, the seed is lighter, and on the dark side, the color is lighter. So if you really wanted to match something exactly, like say you were using a logo from a company, like if this was Coca-Cola red, it would be really important to get that right. So that's just a little trick you can use. Okay, so I like it being mostly red. I think I'm gonna go with that. Okay, trying to figure out what I want to do next with this one. Let's just go ahead and make the seat this gray color. So now you can see that that seat is much darker, and that is because the black that works the red does not work for this gray. So exactly like the other one, and in this case I didn't use a lasso tool, I'm just filling this in quickly with a brush. Instead of having to reselect that to adjust the black here, all I can do is grab my wand tool, and it will grab all this color because it's just a solid thing. So now I can affect the black underneath and start to lighten that up. And I want to get this kind of warm gray color, so it's going to be pretty light actually, something like that. Yeah, so there you go. You know what, in this case I want to do something kind of weird with this green, just to show you how the color can be affected. I'm going to duplicate this layer in case I mess it up. Another great thing about digital work is that you can make unlimited numbers of copies in case you mess something up. And I think what I want to do is play with, I don't know, I just got this Photoshop working. This is CS5, which is way, way older than what you have access to now. I think this is from like 12 years ago, but it just works so much faster for the way that I sketch, and I get weird brush lag occasionally with Photoshop CC, so I have just gone back to the dark ages essentially. Okay, so that's way too dark. I am going to just pick this and color on top of everything because I want to see if this will work. It's kind of a weird brush. Essentially what I want to do is just some kind of weird paint job. I don't know, I'm thinking like something kind of tribal-y based on what I've sketched on here. And so the trick with doing a paint job, in the same way that you're thinking about how shadows and light affect a round form, if I'm going to say that, you know, somebody took a dry brush to this chair, you need to treat these forms like somebody was painting on something round. So right here, for instance, that green line goes against what the form is doing, and so I'm just going to come in here and erase away parts of it so that they align themselves with what this surface is doing, which is wrapping around. And all these edges need to change at the edge of the chair, just like the shadows did, because I am trying to show that this object has volume. And so all of these edges need to be rounded out to make sense with the overall form. I mean, this is kind of an ugly chair, but like I really like this green and red combo together. I think another side effect of me being colorblind is the fact that I trend towards really obvious color choices, so really bright reds, like really deep blues. Like I think the issue is that I just lose subtlety. And so you can see that in my work, like it's very all, there's just a lot of strong color choices. And I don't mean strong like strong decisions, just they're strong, heavily saturated colors because heavily saturated colors are easier for me to see. Yeah, so this feels like a weird kind of candy cane zebra stripe thing going on, but I think it's okay. Yeah, it is kind of a graffiti look. So all I'm doing is just, I splashed it down there without really thinking, and now I'm going back through and making all of my decisions look a little more cleaned up, and all I'm doing is just making them follow the form. Everything needs to be round because everything is painted onto a cylinder, so yeah, that looks okay. I mean, it looks weird, but it looks like it's painted accurately. So what I'm going to do now is just flip through the filters and find something that works because I want the shading to still be applied with this color on top. That kind of gets there. That doesn't. So yeah, none of these are really working for me the way I want them to. So I'm going to leave it on color. And what I'm going to do next is just select those parts that I painted, and we're just going back to do what we've been doing from the beginning, which is change this black layer. So changing the lightness levels, and now that green starts to come through. And it has all the shadows. The downside is because I used the, what's it called, the lasso tool, it's not super great about picking edges, and so it's affected the red all the way around these edges here, which is not ideal. If I wanted to, I could go back through and fix that, but that's going to take a long time, so there's got to be a simpler way to do this. Let me think. I don't know, maybe I'll just leave that for now. I'm not really sure. Okay, so this is going to be a little complicated, but I think this is going to solve my issue. Okay, what do I have to do to get rid of that? Oh, okay. I don't know, essentially I've painted myself into a corner, and oh, that's weird. I'm guessing that everybody already got this emergency alert for staying indoors. God, my phone really just lost it. That was startling. I'm just going to leave this here. I think that was a sign. I'm going to stop messing with this. Okay, so that's the second one. Okay, third one here. Again, we've got our colors. I am going to do primary. It's going to be this brown because it looks like a wooden chair. Again, color layer. That's pretty close, actually. So I think this amount of black is actually pretty accurate. I'm going to bring it down just a little bit, though. Oh, you know what? It's because I didn't have that color layer correct. So now I'm going to bring that black back in. Okay, we got that. And then I think the seat would do well in this blue. So this process works really well, especially if you have something simple, like you know, a product that has one or two colors, like a chair, for instance. It's a little bit harder when you start working on more complicated objects, or like you're painting a scene. Um, that can get complicated really quick, and it can have a lot more colors than just three involved. So just because this works in this case doesn't mean it's going to work for everything. But if you have something that's a similar complexity, I think it'll be just fine. So I'm just trying to match this. I want to be just a little bit lighter. And then we've got this light brown. I think for this one I'm just going to treat all of the connecting points. So what I'm finding is I thought I wasn't painting, but if we look at our color layer, that light brown, I'm trying to find a good way to explain this. These colors are very similar in terms of how much black is in them, I think. Because when I paint over the top of this, I'm not seeing a big difference, but I know that I am painting here. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball this, fill in these spaces, and then just like I did before, I'm just going to use the wand tool. I grabbed all of those, and I'm going to lighten up the black layer. There we go. This is quite a bit lighter. You can see how tan that is. And now that the underlying spot has been shown, it's got these little messes on the edges, and I can just go in and clean those up on yet again another layer. So especially something in an early stage, like if I was to show this to a client, it would be okay if it had some rough edges, because I think of these levels of sketches as kind of like a revision. It's like somebody picked a very loose sketch from a group that I sent them, and they want to see a handful of them. This would generally be the next stage if a client was like, I really like A, B, and C over there. And so I would take those three designs and then bring them up to a slightly tighter drawing, which is what these chairs are, and then I might add a little bit of color. And I wouldn't spend too long doing it, because some of these are not going to make the final cut, and so you want to just do enough to get it across. So there we go. We've got three chairs. And they've got decent color combos that I think I would have really struggled to come up with on my own. And they all came from, not that one, this layer. So these three images kind of created each of the associated color palettes. There, there, and there. So it's 8:22, so I've got about an hour left. The next one I'm going to do is this environment. This is going to be a little bit more complicated, and it's going to include a little bit more painting. But this is from an earlier workshop, and so what we had talked about is doing environmental drawings, and this is just a really simple 3D model. It's honestly essentially just a bunch of blocks that all kind of come together, and it looks like a cityscape. I think I might actually have the model up. Yeah, here, I'll show it to you real quick. Here, I'm going to save this camera real quick. And I can bring this little render window. So essentially what I did was draw a tiny little city based on some thumbnail sketches. That should be cleaning itself up now. But that little city allowed me to create a pretty interesting backdrop to do an overlay sketch on without a ton of work. I'm pretty sure this model took about 15 minutes, and that is because you can see, like, even with a really simple rudimentary sense of modeling, there's not a lot going on here. It's just a bunch of cubes, my little truck, because I know the seniors in the design major are currently doing a sponsored project with semi-trucks, and so I just knew that I wanted that truck to be in the foreground, and I built enough background to fill that in. So that is where my background image came from. So this is still going to be pretty rough looking, but all I'm going to do is drop in some color to make this pretty gray, nondescript space feel like it has a sense of place. And the two places are two places that I've actually lived, Chicago and LA. So this first one, I'm just going to blow this up here for you so you can see it. This first one is of the L, the elevated train that goes around Chicago, and it's just like middle of the day. There's some haze in the background. It looks like it could just be a summer day, middle of the day with like really interesting lighting happening. I don't know, I just think there's some interesting stuff going on here. It's pretty neutral, honestly, color-wise, and we can see how complicated it is, again, if we just knock out the color. So, you know, it goes to bright white. In some places it goes to full black, but not a lot. And I don't know, there's just a good balance of contrast, I think. So that's going to be kind of what I aim for. I'm just going to leave that here. I might reference it later. So I'm going to keep this image up here to reference, but I'm also going to do what I just did. Excuse me. I'm going to do what I did with the image reference for the chair. I'm going to apply that filter. And so that filter is going to give me a group of colors to work with. I'm just going to put it down here in this little box. There we go. Okay, I'm obviously having some technical difficulties with Photoshop. Occasionally, if you press buttons too quickly, things just freeze up on you. So, okay, so we've got our color picker down here. So we can use that if we decide to, but in this case, because I'm going to be trying to match the feelings that are happening in this, I'm actually going to pick directly from the colors that are happening there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is use this environment as my my shading path. So imagine if I had done this line drawing and added in the shadows and added in the light parts. And I think what I'm going to do is make a couple layers of this. I'm going to do a multiply layer and an overlay layer, so I can play with the lights on this layer and then the darks on this layer. And so isolating those two things is going to make my life easier, because you don't want to be shifting light and dark in the same time, because you're going to confuse yourself really quickly. If you can just play with one aspect of the drawing at a time, you'll save yourself a lot of headaches. Okay, so just like the other one, I'm going to start nesting these things on top of each other. And what they're nested on top of is just a white box, so it's just a white neutral background. And I guess I'll just get started. So I will start with a color layer. I think I'll start with a color layer, which will allow the saturation to kind of just apply itself down here. And you can see these buildings off in the distance get really blue, and that's just because of the environment, like the actual atmosphere, the distance it takes to get there, starts to make things blue in the distance during certain times of day. So I'm going to pick a nice, I don't know, I guess this kind of painterly brush and start to loosely paint in the background. And I feel like this is just kind of like one of those, I don't know, art school 101 things, that if you're working on something like an environment or something with color, it's a good idea to start from the back and work your way forwards, because that way you're kind of layering things on top of one another. I don't know why that makes sense, but it's worked for me in the past, so I'm going to stick with it. So I'm just grabbing slightly different gray variations, and gray over gray is not going to look that much different, but as we get to the foreground, you can see that there's a little bit more warmth that's happening in some of these buildings. So I have to make some decisions about these buildings actually being a certain color, a certain hue. So this close one is going to be this warmer color. Maybe I'll apply a little of that back here. I want some transfer because it's just doing full opacity or full black or full white is basically what that brush is set up to do. And I really like this orange that's happening in here for the elevated track. I'm going to bring that in as well. So for anybody who's in the Western workshop, are all your other classes online currently? Or is it just the ones that can be done online? Like the teachers that have the ability to do that? Like I'm just so unaware of like where you guys are at currently. Just kind of a weird time, I guess. And I think I want this truck because it was supposed to be the focal point before. I would like to make that the focal point again, and I'm going to use color to do that. I'm going to go back to a normal brush because that other brush is freaking me out. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, I guess we could use this orange van in the front as a highlight color. It's kind of nice. So you're seeing that like not all these colors are working, and that's because my color balance is not right because of how light and dark some of these grays are. So I'm going to do a little trick here. I'm going to see if this works. So I'm going to see if I can take everything but the line out of here because I need the line to reference what I'm doing. So now this can be a multiply layer, and I'll be able to see what I'm doing a little bit better. There, that color is working better now. And the nice thing about having my grayscale underdrawing is that I can always come back because I'm losing some of the shadows here, but I can take my multiply layer and bring that up top, and all of a sudden I get those shadows back. You know, this is going to get a little bit confusing because I like to play with layers a lot, but all I'm really trying to show right now is that if you are having trouble with color, it's as simple as finding something for reference and then applying that to what your issue is. So I'm going to give the sky just a little bit of a tone, and I'm going to knock the stuff back even further. And it's going to make all this stuff feel like it's further away. So with the chair, I was pushing things back by making them darker, but with an environment, I think it's generally a good rule of thumb that things get lighter as they go away from you. Like you can just see in this photo, like those buildings in the far distance, you can't even see them really because they're just kind of blown out because of the lighting scenario, and that lighting scenario is what I'm trying to duplicate here. I'm going to grab some of these colors and just keep working with them. I'm just kind of painting in the lines to get all this stuff right. You can even grab the color of the train, apply that. So I probably could have picked an easier subject for an environment, but I had this waiting, and I had done it for the previous class, so that's why I brought it back. We're going to have a lot of taxis here because this is definitely a city scene. So I just need to find a good yellow. There we go. Now I can apply that to all of these guys. And if we need to find some more color diversity, we just go back to our reference. Grab a color, this kind of weird purple for this guy here. Some sort of Volvo, maybe. It's like a Volvo-y color. And then the street color as well, because the ground is looking a little bit light to me. So I'm going to bring in a little bit of darkness based on my color reference. I'm also trying to be aware of like what my environment already looks like the perspectives. And so all of this stuff kind of continues to follow. Like I wouldn't just paint weird scribbles because all of a sudden it will start to take the viewer away from what I'm trying to show them. And what I'm trying to do is duplicate this image here in its color balance. So I just continue to pick grays because all these grays are slightly different. Some of them are cool, some are warm. It's like some kind of light post in the foreground. I can apply that gray to these other ones as well. And I'm just using this reference over to the side to help me make all these decisions, because if I was painting this on my own, it would just be a muddy brown mess. I don't know why that is. I think part of it is probably just the fact that I don't do a lot of painting from life, and that can help solve a lot of these issues, honestly. Do quick. So one of the things I want to do is add windows to all of these buildings, but I don't know if I need to or not, because I'm really just dealing with a color right now. I don't want to get too sidetracked. It's just like what my head keeps seeing. Okay, so I will ignore that for now. Maybe I'll paint in the little things here and there, like a few windows. Because I'm not actually trying to paint a scene. I'm just trying to get a reasonable facsimile of what I have over here. So some of these details will be helpful for that, and other ones will just be like done because I get a little neurotic about that stuff. Like this obviously looks like a kid's toy car, like in terms of its shape, but if we color it the right way, and you zoom out, this starts to look like a real city. The things that are really missing right now are the details on these buildings, and that's what's making me kind of frustrated. But, I don't know, let's see. Maybe I can just drop in a few simple indications, as long as I keep them balanced. I think we should be okay. Yeah, painting is actually the best practice for color I've found. I've taken some color theory classes in school, but honestly, just painting from life or painting from reference, that app that I was talking about last night, actually, if you remember, Heavy Paint is a really great app to get better at painting. Whenever I have some free time to myself, I will often just pick up my iPad and just give it a go. Yeah, those are all off. That's going to bug me later. And that's a really enjoyable tool to use. And it forces you to match what you see in your reference with what's on your screen. So all I'm doing right now is just dropping in some lines that will appear to be windows. And these will just follow all of the perspectives that are already happening here. Yeah, that kind of looks better. Yeah, so it's kind of getting there. And grab some more color. The foreground is looking really unfinished, so I'm just going to drop in a few shapes to make it feel more complete. I'm going to drop in a little window, and like I really like this blue that's reflecting on all the glass. It's a really nice detail that I think will make certain portions of this feel real all of a sudden. Yeah, watch his videos. Vaughn is really good about explaining what he's doing and why, like the decisions he makes. Some of them he's a little more like, I guess, teacherly, and other ones it's like he's just doing it because he wants to paint, and so he's like a little less on the explaining side, but there's definitely something to be learned from all of his videos. I'm just color picking a few darks to detail out what's happening in the foreground. And you can see this blue applies to all the windows on most of the vehicles, so if you wanted to, you can start to drop this in as well. But yeah, it's honestly just like a color by numbers kind of a thing, and you can just keep going back and forth to make sure that you get the right colors for your image. Yeah, that's kind of getting there. So if I was going to take this to like a more finished place, honestly, it's just going to be like 3 more hours of what I'm doing now. It's like balancing color, balancing the shadows and the lights, adding in details so it stops feeling so much like a 3D model. And that would basically be it. One thing that I would like to see if I could do, I really like that really bright light that's coming down. So I'm going to use my lasso tool again to isolate a few areas, and I want to see if I can like duplicate that that light going across. It's going to go over this car, and off into the distance. Now, and you can see in the reference that it doesn't actually white it out as much as I just did, so I'll bring that down a little bit. Again, it's just like playing with opacity. Yeah, I don't know, it looks okay, but not great. I think it's a little distracting. It looks painted on at the moment. Maybe if I do an overlay layer, yeah, that helps a little bit. It's decent. And I will probably need to show that other things are getting lit really brightly, so I'm just using that same light, applying that to different things. This would be a good chance right up here. So this thing in the foreground is getting really lit up. And maybe even the top of the truck. Let's see if I can find any. So the truck has been, I'm referencing this guy, this little van here to make that orange read correctly. And so you can see the highlights are actually kind of purpley and white. So I'm going to grab those and see if I can just paint in some quick highlights. So this truck was very, very shiny. It's also very long. I'm noticing this is a weirdly long truck. It's like a limousine. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at with that. So I will take all these layers and put them in a group, and you can see if I bring one of my environments back down. So color and no color. Like, I don't know, I think I've been working on that for almost 20 minutes, and it already looks like way more finished than it had previously. And all I had to do was just take a few layers and color pick all of that stuff up there. Okay, so the next one that I'm going to try to do is, let's see, so this one is LA at night. So I want to take a completely different scene, like the one I had before. Let's call this one Chicago. Is like middle of the day, like I said before, strong lighting environment. And now what I'm going to do for LA is something, I don't know, I guess it's more complicated, but it's just a different lighting scenario. So I'm going to blow this up just so we can see what it looks like. This is going to be a little bit tougher because I'm going to have to take, like this is a pretty different situation. Like there's stuff in the far, far distance and there's stuff up close. But what I can still learn from this is the fact that these buildings up close have a lot more contrast than the ones in the back, which is, you know, what we applied to the previous one, but also you can see like how much more contrast there is on the things that are up close to us. In addition to that, I'm seeing all these like little lights in the background and how they glow, so I think that will be something that will be kind of fun to try to work into the drawing. So, I don't know, this is going to be a little bit of an experiment because this is kind of a very disparate color choice from what I have going on my background environment, because this is it's just shot in a different way. So I think what I'm going to have to do before I even add color is play with the lighting situation, because all these grays still make it feel like it's kind of the middle of the day. And so I'm going to have to change the balance first, the balance of black and white. So first I'm just going to add, like I did before, a black layer on top of everything, just to darken stuff up. And I'm going to be doing, honestly, the identical thing that I did with the chair, which is just like creating a lighting environment. You know, looking at this reference, you can see that the sky is darker at the top and it's very dark at the bottom. And so because of that, I want to add just some really simple gradients that make the foreground darker. And I also want, just in this little spot up here where the sky is, I want that to be a little darker too. So I want the sky to be, you can see that like the sky is almost the same value as some of these buildings, and so I don't want that much contrast between the buildings and the sky. You know, just doing that starts to make it feel, I missed this little spot down here, that's why it was wrong. Just going to add that little guy. Now, there we go. Yeah, that's all working a little bit better. And I think I need to add a little bit of darkness coming in from the side too. So right now it looks like the sun is coming down and lighting these buildings, and I need to get rid of that direction in the lighting. And I think the last thing I'm going to use is just a brush that's very soft. All I'm doing is knocking down some of those direct lights. Yeah, so that feels a little bit more like nighttime to me. The next thing I'm going to do is just go in and kind of add more shadows. Because even though it's nighttime, there's still going to be some cast shadows because all these buildings, I imagine, are going to be lit up. And actually, I'm going to try to darken up all these buildings. Push them back a little bit because they all look a little too light to me. what I'm doing right now is the same thing I did with the chair. It's like a slightly different version of grayscale rendering, but what I'm doing right now is getting all of my lights and darks to feel right before I get into color, because it's a lot easier to change these when I'm just dealing with dark and light. I don't have to deal with dark and light and color all at once. It's just like, it's a little overwhelming. It's maybe a little too much, but yeah, that's working. I'm going to go back to my reference real quick. It's hard to tell because this is kind of a weird lighting scenario, but I feel like the buildings continue to get darker as they get lower, and so I want to make sure that there's a nice gradient happening with all of these, especially this one in the background. I want this one to be offset by a lot of darkness. I'll darken that up, and I don't know what this empty space is here. Maybe that's a building behind it. I gotta make some kind of decision because right now it just looks like weird, light colored shapes. Yeah, I don't want it darker than that building, but that's better. The last thing I'm gonna do, because this truck again is gonna be in my foreground, I need to isolate it in terms of lighting, and so I want the background to be darker around it. And the nice thing about having this already rendered out background is that I can just keep lassoing things just by following the lines, so it's a lot like you know, coloring book basically. It's just a much more complicated coloring book than you're normally used to, because I'm deciding which lines to color inside. So now I'm going to erase away just a little bit, and that will help the, I guess, the elevated train stand out a little bit more. I need to get my old brushes back. I'm wasting a lot of time making brushes every time I do this, but because I just switched back to this old version of Photoshop, all of my brush presets have disappeared along with my old version. Yeah, I will definitely add in the lights for the last part. That will definitely happen. So I'm drawing over the foreground, which I want to avoid, so I guess I'm just going to go back with the lasso again. But yeah, Genevieve, I will light the situation. But again, like I did with the chair, I'm focusing on the shadows first, because I think the shadows just have more of an effect on the image than the lights do. I think that's more just a preference thing. I don't know if that's actually true or not. Okay, so we've gone from, shoot, I've been working on top of my environment, which is a big no-no. I was painting on top of that, which is really frustrating. I'm going to have to get this untouched one, bring that back in. Okay, so that's where we're at, and now we've darkened it up, and it feels very dark. It's like the power went out or something, and I'm just seeing a glaring thing here. This train is way too light for the rest of the scene. Yeah, that's better. So now, same thing with the lighting scenario. I think the main light is going to come from just a lot of diffused lighting that's actually going to come off all of these buildings. And they're kind of like, they're all bouncing off of one another. You can see like down here, this row of buildings has some kind of light that's just like spraying brightness across all of them, and then the foreground you have these trees that aren't lit by anything. So that layering effect I think is really cool. So we're going to take a look at what this looks like in black and white, so I can kind of get a feel for what that lighting situation feels like. So again, you can look at it in color, you can look at it in black and white, and right now I'm just focusing on the bounce between this shadow side and this light side to get a feeling for how much light I want to bring back into this image. So I'm just playing with a few layer tricks here. See if I can just find a new normal. So I just added another layer on top of what I painted just for a little bit of contrast. So I think that's making some of the things stand out in a nice way, so I'm going to leave that. Now on an overlay layer, I can start thinking about where my light is coming from. And so, okay, thinking about all these buildings, I think it would be really cool if there's light coming from in between them. So anywhere there's a gap. So there's a gap in the street right here. What I'm going to do is just grab all of those holes so I can paint them all at once. So I know that this is a color theory thing, but we're getting into a little bit of lighting because color can't exist without light. It's like if you're in a completely dark room, you don't know what color the walls are painted, and that's because there's no light bouncing off of the walls and then landing on your eye, which sends a message up to your brain. And so for the same reason, we need to understand at least the basics of how to light a scene. So you can see if I go full white, it just kind of blocks out the background, but if I change this to an overlay layer, it's a lot more subtle. Now I can erase back in to get that nice gradation, so we can like see that it's coming from the left side. Now I also want, so there's not a lot of streets here, so I'm going to have to make some of this stuff up. But I know that I want a lot of cast light down on the street. So what I can do is start to bring, not seeing any of it. Oh, it's because I was using my eraser. Okay, so there we go. Now I can start layering in different little lights in here. Some of these lights that I'm layering in could be street lamps. A lot of these are actually going to be coming from cars, so like car headlights. So now I'm starting to think about not just the light from the scene, but what things within the scene are actually going to be casting light. If I said that there's light coming from that side, I think it's safe to say that we could have some light coming from over here. I definitely want some light on this truck here. I'm imagining that there's like maybe this pole right here is a big street light that's facing down on this truck. So now this foreground is lit up pretty nicely. You can see that like just bringing that in starts to give this image a lot more depth. Just some more cast light. I suppose the truck is going to have some lights too, so I should probably give him a little bit. Okay, so I think the other thing I want to do in this image, it seems like some of these buildings are just like, some of their sides are just lit, so I'm just going to start grabbing some kind of random faces of buildings and start painting a little bit of light onto them and see if it gives me something nice and interesting. You know, just something random like that little spot. I think there could be something cool. These. I'm just kind of picking at random parts of the building that kind of get lit up a little bit. And again, that just gives you a little bit more depth. I definitely want the top of this truck to be probably the lightest colored part because it's facing directly up. So any cast light that comes down on top of it is going to have a big effect on it. Yeah, okay. So before I start getting into the really, really brights, like you can see there's some spotlights on these buildings, I really want to start bringing this color palette in, which I haven't really done at all yet, because rather on the other one of the things that I realized is I kind of jumped the gun on this one, and that's why it feels a little bit gray and muddy, because I didn't take the time to get the underpainting right. So already I like this one more, and hopefully that means that the color will go on a little bit easier. So let's see, I'm just going to start with the very obvious gradient that's happening here, which is a purple to a kind of orange. So the gradient has a few different options. Right now it's going from a color to transparent, but I want that to be purple to orange. You can see it here. I just did that accidentally. But that is kind of the vibe of that image. So let's see what we can do by playing with some of these filters. Let's see what color gets us. So color gets us actually something that's kind of interesting. I'm going to erase away a little bit of the foreground and see what that looks like. So the things that are close are going to be more their true color, which is going to be a lot of grays. But this in the distance could still be pretty light colored, which I think is kind of nice. And because it's on a color layer, it's not adding any, lights or darks. It's just literally doing what is in the background. And I kind of want to offset that with some actual bright colors. We can see looking at all of these, like the brights get like crazy bright. It's like this gold reflective thing happening, which is really pretty, and I think it's going to be kind of complicated for me to replicate, but I am going to try. Okay, so the sun is obviously setting in this scene. So let's see what happens if I start treating some of these buildings like that. Most namely this one in the background. Probably the ones close to it. Okay, so what I'm painting is just straight color. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. It looks like the image too, which is what we were shooting for. Yeah, it's getting there. I'm trying to think of what I want to do next, because these buildings are so densely packed with different colors and lights. I think I might need to shift what brushes I'm using. I would kill for a square brush right now, and I do not have one. See if I can just pull down some fresh brushes. Drop shadow, M brushes, I don't know what that means. Square brushes. There we go. Okay, I've got my square, but I want to make windows, so this is going to have to add some spacing to it. There we go. Yeah, so now I should be able to paint in some windows. Yeah, there you go. Windows galore. Okay, so all these windows are the same kind of like yellowy white color. So rather than just paint them like that, which is going to look a little weird, what I'm going to do is space these out a little further. So now I've made a brush that can make windows. So these don't have to be perfect, but what I'm going to do is knock out a couple, because another thing that I'm noticing is that they're they're all scattered, like they're just knocked out, kind of like, a real building would be. You're not going to have every single light on in the space. So I'm just going to selectively go through. I don't have to be super careful. I mean, I don't want to hit right in between them, but Need to hit enough that it looks random. Maybe whole sections too. We'll give it a little bit of more realistic feel. Okay. I get some on the edges. So this now becomes my, I don't know, it's like a stamp. It's like a window stamp. I'm going to leave it over here, but let's start with this one in the back. And the nice thing about all of these like very square buildings is that all you have to do is take your outer selection and make sure it fits to the rest of the building. And you've got a building with windows. I think those are a little bit bright, but I think generally it's kind of hitting the right keys with this. So I'm going to do that a few more times, but I'm going to darken this just a little bit. Yeah, that is the joy of working in digital media, that you can just kind of adjust this stuff and make up shapes as you go. So I guess they're all going to be kind of square shaped, but we can change the width of some of these, because now I really just want to add in a lot of this stuff, because looking at this reference, there's just a lot of these bright little yellow dots, different sizes, different gaps. And knock some out there. And so what I'm going to do is just allow these to kind of work like shapes that I can control and put into perspective. And hopefully it tricks your eye into thinking that they all work. So I'm going to have to really scrunch this, because you can see this line on these buildings, that's a perspective line, so this has got to get much bigger. It's frustrating because I'm moving so far off the canvas that I have to keep shifting back and forth to look at it. Yeah, it's sort of working. There we go. The bottom wasn't lined up. Yeah, okay. So now I just have to cut away. So I put the overlay. That kind of works. I think actually, like, color burner, I want these to be really bright. That's kind of nice. So color dodge is actually making them darker when they're on something darker. I'm going to do that to these windows too. Yeah, that's kind of cool. It just feels right. But now what I have to do is erase everything away that is not fitting onto my perspective grid, which is just going to take a few seconds, but what is going to be left are windows that all work in the perspective that I had set up earlier. So because of this line work, this is kind of starting to look like some kind of comic book, which I don't really mind, because I really like black line work on most of my stuff. I never really do a lot of photorealistic renderings. When I do, it's more labor intensive, but there's just something about good, like, black line work that I think works in a lot of different genres. So yeah, and it can go a couple of different ways. Like I said, this feels a little bit like a comic book to me. Part of that is the subject matter, but I just like these black outlines and these simple shapes. So yeah, you can see it's starting to come together a little bit. My image is still looking very gray, and I did that kind of on purpose when I erased that away in the foreground, but I don't want to lose all this interesting stuff that's happening here. So I want to find a color that's light gray, but not as uninteresting. So I really like this deep blue, and that seems like a good foreground color. So I'm going to step away from the windows for a second, and so we've got our square brushes, and we've got all these nonsense brushes. I don't know what to call them. Sorted brushes. These are all crappy. Natural brushes? Nope. God, I know that I've got a folder of like 20 different brush packs, and I would kill to know where those are at right now, because all these brushes are very boring. I don't know, I guess we'll just make it work. So in the foreground, what I'm going to do is bring in that blue color. And this is on that overlay layer, and already I like that because this blue makes it feel like nighttime. I don't know, there's just something about it. And it's also a nice bounce between the blue and the red. It's like kind of a cool, warm thing going on. I don't know, I like that. So I'm just, it might be a little hard to see in YouTube, but on my screen there's a pretty obvious difference between the foreground and the background colors here. The other thing I want to make blue is this train, because this is going to create kind of a mid ground. So the focus in the foreground is the truck, the midground is this train, and then the city makes up the background. Let's see. I want to start working on this close building and a couple of other lights. It's 9/11, I got like 10 more minutes left, and then I'll start to wrap things up, but see if I can just get a little bit more interest happening here. These windows will just sit on this side. And I think I said color dodge. Yeah, that'll work. And because these are in the foreground, I need some of them to be dark. You know, if you look in some of those images, a lot of these windows are actually out. Same thing with the other ones, actually. I'm not sure the best way to do this is. Maybe, okay, so this layer, I'm just going to knock some of these windows out and make them look like they are burned out, or not burned out, the lights just turned off. Square brush. Now it's tough to do things that look random. Humans in general have a really hard time dealing with random things. I mean, that's part of the reason people believe in conspiracy theories, is because it adds a degree of understanding to an otherwise chaotic situation. And so it's also hard for people to create something that looks random, because our brains just want to see patterns everywhere. So I'm just doing my best to make these decisions look random, even though I know that that is an impossible task. Okay, so yeah, that looks a little bit better. So what I'm going to do now is bring some color into the foreground, because I think that that's pretty lacking. And there's still something about the space over here. It's this kind of lavender, pretty color. I'm going to apply it to the truck and some of these spaces down here. And I want a fresh layer because I want to actually paint the color that I'm pulling from here. I don't want to play with any layer filters, because it's just going to start to confuse myself. I just need a normal brush, nothing silly. Okay, let's see how this looks. And I can't even tell. It's just such a subtle color. There we go. It's maybe a little too purple, actually. Yeah, that's too much. You know what? I don't really have a good foreground to reference here. What I am going to do, though, is start to color in some lights because it's just something fun to do. What I'm going to do here is change my brush filter. So filters apply to layers, but they can also apply to brushes. And set, yeah, color dodge. So a brush set on color dodge will start to actually like lighten the more times you go over and over the same spot. So you can see a lot of these windows have kind of a glowing effect around them. So I'm going to start doing that. And this will allow me to really paint in like some pretty bright lights. I think it's more useful off in the distance. And I have to, obviously that last brush that I just made kind of covered up some of the foreground, so I just have to be really careful as I'm doing this to make sure that I erase away anything like that. And that will keep all that light that I'm adding in the background. So now you can see how spotty that is. I'm just kind of adding random lights wherever. Cars get them, buildings get them. And the further you go in the distance, the smaller these lights are and the more blurry they get. So I can add a lot of just kind of random noise to indicate that there's a lot going on in here. That's too much. You know, and as you get closer to the camera, these lights are going to have to make more and more sense. Because you can see in that image as well, like the lights are less blurry when they're close. I'm just kind of playing around here with that one. This train's got lights. I guess I'm just using these lights right now as kind of like tracers, like if there was a long exposure photograph or something, you'd be able to see the taillights moving. I think I'm just doing that because I'm starting to get a little bored with this painting. I'm trying to keep it interesting for myself. And then on this truck, I don't want to just paint a rough or a soft circle, so I'm just going to isolate a little area there. So this truck also has lighting happening. And perhaps the top of this can be lit as well. And really any surface that's facing up could also get like a little bit of this light to set it off from the background. So yeah, this has become a little bit of a lighting exploration and a color exploration, but hopefully you can see between this and the reference that I didn't have to make a lot of decisions color-wise because I just allowed the photo to lead me towards something that looks similar, even though the subject matter, I mean, it is a city, but it's a very different perspective. It's an object I created, and I'm just using the parts of that that I know I would do a poor job of approximating on my own, which is color. So I hope you guys got something out of that. I guess I will keep leaving these up, so if anybody who missed this, if you guys know anybody in the workshop that just couldn't make this work because of scheduling, I'll leave this up so you can go back and review anything that you didn't understand. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. I'm going to have to look at the syllabus. I don't know what I was planning for next Monday, but I will send up a wrap-up email tomorrow with this. Yeah, so I will save out this Photoshop file, and everybody on the email chain should have access to it, so you can see all these layers and turn them on and off if you are so inclined, and start to play with, like, see what this looks like, and you can change the opacity, like, you know, effectively just use my painting and be able to pull it apart and go through the different steps that I did. So, yeah, I hope that was interesting to you guys. It's kind of cool, just flipping between those two, seeing the difference. Same, you know, starting point, very different vibes by the end of it. I feel like the chair turned out better than the environments, but, you know, we can't have everything work all of the time. There we go. Yeah, so I'll organize these and hopefully it's not too complicated to wade through if anybody wants to check it out later. Yeah, I guess that's about it. Thanks, guys, for checking this out, and I will see you next Monday. Adios.